Sign it, Sophia. Don't make this more embarrassing than it already is. You're 34. In this town, you're not a visionary's wife anymore. You're an antique. Take the Audi, take the Connecticut house, and go find a hobby before I decide you aren't even worth the alimony." Brian's voice was like a serrated blade wrapped in silk. He sat there, the king of Manhattan tech, smirking behind a mahogany desk while his mistress waited in a running car downstairs. He expected a war. He expected tears, screaming, and a year-long siege of his $400 million empire. Instead, Sophia Sterling didn't say a single word. She didn't negotiate. She didn't cry. In 3 minutes, she signed away every right to the life they built and walked out into the rain. Brian thought he had won the lottery. He didn't realize that Sophia wasn't surrendering. She was clearing the battlefield. Because while Brian was playing the hero of his own story, Sophia had already moved the king into checkmate. The air inside the private arbitration suite at Sterling and Vance smelled of expensive misery, stale espresso, aggressive cologne, and the cold, ionized scent of a high-powered air conditioning unit. It was the kind of room where fortunes were bled dry and legacies were amputated. Brian Thorne sat at the head of the table, his posture a masterclass in studied arrogance. He adjusted the cuff of his bespoke suit, ensuring his Patek Philippe caught the light. He checked the time for the 4th time in 10 minutes. He had a flight to Aspen at 6, and Catelyn, his former executive assistant and current soulmate, was already texting him photos of the designer ski gear she wanted to buy. Across from him sat Sophia. If Brian was a portrait of nervous energy disguised as power, Sophia was a marble statue. She wore a charcoal vintage Dior suit, tailored so sharply it looked like armor. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, perfect chignon. No jewelry. Not even the 15-carat emerald she had worn for a decade. That had been left on the vanity of their Tribeca penthouse 3 weeks ago, on the morning she found the second phone hidden in the lining of Brian's gym bag. "Look, Sophia," Brian said, his voice dropping into that condescending baritone he used when explaining complex algorithms to venture capitalists. "We can do this the hard way or the easy way. My offer is more than fair. You get the house in Greenwich, the SUV, and a monthly stipend of $15,000 for 3 years. That's plenty for someone with your limited marketability." Brian's lawyer, a man named Silas Vance, a shark famous for making senators' wives suffer, slid a thick folder across the table. Silas smirked. "It's a generous exit package, Mrs. Thorne. Considering you haven't held a job since 2014, your contribution to the growth of Thorne Logic is, legally speaking, negligible." The silence in the room stretched, thick and suffocating. Silas clicked his pen. Tick, 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 a rhythmic psychological tactic designed to break a person's nerves. Brian watched her, waiting for the crack. He thought he knew her better than anyone. He remembered the Sophia of 10 years ago, the soft, emotional girl who had proofread his code in a basement in Queens while they shared a single bowl of ramen. He remembered the woman who had smoothed over his PR disasters and hosted the dinner parties that won him his first seed funding. She was the support system, the soft place to land. In Brian's mind, Sophia was a ghost of his past, a relic of his struggle years that no longer fit his billionaire aesthetic. "I don't want the Greenwich house," Sophia said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it possessed a strange crystalline clarity that cut through the lawyer's rhythmic clicking. Brian sighed, rolling his eyes at Silas. "Here we go. What do you want, Sophia? The Hamptons estate? I told you, that's tied up in the holding company. You can't have it." "I don't want the Hamptons estate," she said, her eyes fixed on the documents. "I don't want the car. I don't want the monthly stipend." Silas stopped clicking his pen. The smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a look of professional suspicion. "I'm sorry. You're rejecting the settlement?" "No," Sophia replied. She reached into her battered leather tote. a bag Brian had told her to throw away months ago because it looked cheap, and pulled out a simple plastic Bic pen. "I'm accepting the divorce, but I'm waiving all rights to marital assets. I want no alimony, no real estate, and no shares in Thorn Logic." Brian froze. He actually felt his heart skip a beat, not out of guilt, but out of a sudden, sharp spike of paranoia. "You're waiving everything. Sophia, Thorn Logic is valued at $400 million. You're entitled to half. Why would you walk away from $200 million? Sophia finally looked up. Her eyes were terrifyingly blank, like the windows of a house whose inhabitants had long since moved out. "I just want to be done," she said simply. "I want to be free of you today, right now. I don't want to spend the next 2 years arguing with lawyers over the price of a sofa. I want my name back, and I want you to sign this NDA, stating that from this moment on, we have no further legal or financial obligations to one another." Silas Vance leaned in, whispering urgently to Brian, "This is a total capitulation. If she signs this, she leaves with nothing. You'd be a fool not to take it." "What's the catch, Soph?" Brian asked, his eyes narrowing. "You've got a boyfriend. Is that it? You're running off with some yoga instructor?" "No catch, Brian. Just a signature. Scratch, scratch, scratch." The sound of her pen on the paper was the loudest noise in the room. She signed 3 copies of the waiver and the final decree. She closed the folder and slid it back toward the shark. "Is that it?" she asked. Brian felt a rush of euphoria so strong it was dizzying. It was a dopamine hit better than any IPO. He had won. He had expected a bloodbath. He had expected to lose half his fortune and his reputation. Instead, she had just rolled over. She was weaker than he thought. She was pathetic. "Yeah," Brian laughed, a nervous, giddy sound. "Yeah, Sophia, that's it. You're free." Sophia stood up. She smoothed the skirt of her Dior suit, her movements fluid and calm. She didn't look at Brian again. She didn't look at Silas. She turned on her heel and walked toward the door. "Wait!" Brian called out, a sudden condescending impulse of pity hitting him. "Sophia, how are you even getting home? Do you have money for an Uber? I can call one for you." She stopped at the door, her hand on the handle. She didn't turn around. "Don't worry about me, Brian," she said softly. "I have a ride." The door clicked shut behind her. Brian turned to Silas and pumped his fist in the air. "Did you see that? Total surrender. I'm a genius. I told you she was a doormat. She didn't even ask for the dog." Silas Vance wasn't celebrating. He was staring at the signature on the page, a deep frown creasing his forehead. "It's too easy, Brian. Nobody walks away from $500 million just for peace of mind. Something is wrong." "Nothing is wrong, Silas. She's broken. I broke her," Brian scoffed, pulling out his phone to text Catelyn the good news. "Now let's get a drink. I'm officially the world's most eligible bachelor." But as Sophia Sterling stepped out of the office building and onto the rain-slicked pavement of Fifth Avenue, she wasn't looking for a taxi. She checked her watch. 11:15 a.m. She walked 2 blocks east to the corner of 57th. A black car was waiting. Not an Uber, not a town car. It was a Rolls-Royce Phantom, the windows tinted so dark they looked like obsidian. The driver, a massive man with a military bearing, stepped out and opened the rear door. "Good morning, Mrs. Thorne," the driver said. "Or should I say Ms. Sterling?" Sophia finally smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a predator that had just watched the trap snap shut. "Ms. Sterling is fine, Gregory," she said, sliding into the cream leather interior. "Take me to Teterboro. The jet is waiting." "And your luggage, ma'am?" "I left it all," she said, leaning back and closing her eyes as the car pulled into traffic. "Everything I need is already on board." Brian Thorne was drunk on victory and 3 neat scotches by 2 o'clock that afternoon. He was holding court in a private booth at Le Bernardin, the kind of place where the silence is as expensive as the caviar. Catelyn sat beside him, looking radiant and sharp in a red Versace dress that Brian had bought her with the company credit card the previous week. She was draped over his arm, giggling as he recounted the story of the morning to a table of his most loyal sycophants, his CFO, his VP of marketing, and a few frat brothers who had ridden his coattails to the top of the tech world. "She literally just signed it," Brian shouted, slamming his hand on the table so hard the silverware jumped. "No fight, no tears. I told her I'd give her 10 grand a month for 3 years, and she looked at me like I was doing her a favor. She's an idiot, guys, a total doormat." "To the Bachelor King!" yelled Dave, the VP of marketing, raising a glass of Krug. "To upgrading!" The table erupted in laughter. Brian felt invincible. For a decade, Sophia had been the anchor, the one who told him to be careful with his spending, the one who reminded him of the ethical implications of their data mining algorithms. Now the anchor was gone. He was a rocket ship, finally free of the weight. He kissed Catelyn hard, his hand sliding up her thigh, oblivious to the eyes of the other patrons. In the middle of his third toast, his phone buzzed. It was Silas Vance. "Gavin," Brian muttered, declining the call. "The shark wants to celebrate his billable hours. Let him wait." The phone buzzed again immediately, then a third time. "Answer it, babe," Catelyn said, tracing the rim of her wine glass with a manicured nail. Maybe she's already begging to come back. Maybe she realized she can't afford her skincare routine on $0 a year. Brian chuckled and picked up. "Silas, tell me the ink is dry. Tell me she's officially the past." "Brian, where are you?" Silas's voice was tight, vibrating with a frequency that made the hair on the back of Brian's neck stand up. "I'm at lunch, celebrating." "Why? What's wrong?" "I'm at the county clerk's office," Silas said. "I came here to file the final decree and the asset waiver immediately, just in case she changed her mind. But Brian, something triggered in the system when I entered the property IDs." "Triggered? What? A fee? Just pay it." "No," Silas hissed. "A lien notification. I'm looking at the title deeds for the Tribeca penthouse and the Hamptons estate. Brian, did you take out a second mortgage on those properties?" "What? No, the company is flush. Why would I take out a mortgage?" "Because according to the city records, neither of those properties belongs to you. Not personally and not through Thorn Logic LLC. Brian lowered his glass. The noise of the restaurant seemed to fade into a dull, underwater hum. "What are you talking about? I bought them. My name is on the deeds." "Your name is on a trust," Silas corrected, his voice dropping to a panicked whisper. "The Aurora Trust. You told me that was your private holding company for tax purposes." "It is. I set it up 5 years ago. My accountant handled it." "I just called your accountant, Brian. He didn't set up the Aurora Trust. He thought I did. I'm looking at the incorporation papers now. You aren't the beneficiary of that trust. You're listed as the trustee, the manager. The beneficiary is an offshore entity registered in the Cayman Islands called Nemesis Holdings." Brian felt the blood drain from his face. A cold, oily sensation settled in his stomach. Nemesis. That's probably just a shell company my previous tax guy used. Who owns Nemesis? "I did a quick cross-reference through a leak in the Panama Papers database," Silas said, and Brian could hear the sound of frantic typing. "The sole signatory for Nemesis Holdings, the person who owns everything inside that trust, is Sophia Sterling." The phone nearly slipped from Brian's hand. "That's impossible. Sophia doesn't know how to set up an offshore shell. She's an art history major, Silas. She spent her days picking out curtains and hosting charity galas. She's a housewife." "Brian, it gets worse," Silas continued, ignoring the outburst. "I had my paralegal run a check on the founding patents for Thorn Logic, the core algorithm, the predictive data engine that makes the company worth $400 million. I wrote that code," Brian snapped, his voice rising, drawing glares from the neighboring tables. "In our basement, in Queens. You wrote the front-end interface, Brian, Silas said, his voice now deathly cold. But the patent for the engine itself? It's not in your name. It was registered in 2014, 2 years before you even incorporated the company. The registrant is S. Sterling. Sophia Sterling. Brian dropped the phone. It clattered onto the white tablecloth, knocking over a glass of red wine. The dark liquid spread across the fabric like a fresh gunshot wound. "Babe?" Catelyn asked, her smile faltering as she reached for his hand. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Brian couldn't breathe. His mind was racing back through a decade of memories. He saw Sophia sitting at her laptop in the middle of the night. He saw her organizing the files. He remembered her asking him to sign the boring tax stuff while he was distracted by a new merger or a mistress. He had trusted her with the administration because he thought she was too simple to understand the power she held. She hadn't waived marital assets. She had walked away with her assets. Assets he had been living in, using as collateral and bragging about for years. Assets that were never his to begin with. "Give me that," Brian hissed, scrambling for the phone. He dialed Sophia's number. "The number you have reached has been disconnected." He dialed again. Same result. "She planned this," Brian whispered, his voice trembling. "She's been planning this for years." "Who? Sophia?" Dave asked from across the table. "Man, forget her. Let's look at the bright side. Check out Instagram. The tabloids are already going nuts over the divorce." Catelyn pulled out her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen. Suddenly, her eyes went wide. She went pale. "Oh my God," she whispered. "What?" Brian demanded, snatching the phone from her hand. It was a post from a high society paparazzo uploaded 4 minutes ago. The headline read, "The billion-dollar rebound, Sophia Sterling spotted in Monaco hours after silent divorce." The photo was high resolution, captured by a long-range drone. It showed the deck of a super yacht, a massive, floating fortress of steel and glass that dwarfed every other boat in the harbour. The name on the hull was visible in gold lettering, the Leviathan. Sitting on the sun deck, wearing a white bikini and holding a glass of vintage champagne, was Sophia. She looked relaxed, radiant, victorious. But it was the man sitting next to her that made Brian's heart stop. He was older, in his late 50s, with silver hair and the kind of physique that suggested private dojos and a diet of pure discipline. He was leaning in, whispering something into Sophia's ear, his hand resting familiarly on her shoulder. Every business student in the world knew that face. It was Sebastian Vane. Not just a billionaire, the billionaire. A man who owned shipping lines, lithium mines and satellite networks. A man whose net worth made Brian's 400 million look like pocket change. But more importantly, Sebastian Vane was known for one thing. He was a merchant of death for tech companies. He bought them, stripped them for parts, and left the CEOs in the gutter. The caption on the photo read, "Sources say Vane and the newly single Ms. Sterling have been close collaborators for years. Is Thorn Logic the next target for the Vane empire?" Brian looked up at his friends. They were all looking at their phones. They were all looking at him. And for the first time, he didn't see admiration in their eyes. He saw the look people give to a man standing on a sinking ship. "Brian?" Catelyn asked, her voice small and sharp. "If she owns the houses, where are we staying tonight?" Brian didn't answer. He was staring at the red wine stain on the table, realizing with a sick, twisting horror that Sophia hadn't just left him. She had declared war. The Thorn Logic headquarters in Dumbo was a temple of glass, steel, and hubris. Usually, when Brian walked through the open-plan office, the air vibrated with the sound of the hustle, the frantic clicking of keyboards, the hum of high-end servers, and the hushed, reverent tones of engineers discussing the future of humanity. But today, as Brian stormed through the lobby, the atmosphere was different. It was the silence of a funeral home. His employees were huddled in small groups, their faces illuminated by the blue light of their smartphones. They weren't looking at code. They were looking at the Leviathan, They were looking at their boss's ex-wife sipping champagne with the man who made a hobby of destroying people like Brian. "Leo, my office, now!" Brian roared, his voice cracking. Leo, the chief technology officer and a man who had been with Brian since the Queen's basement days, followed him into the glass-walled sanctum. Leo looked like he hadn't slept in 48 hours. His eyes were bloodshot and his hands were trembling. "Tell me it's a glitch," Brian hissed, slamming the door. "Silas says the patents are in her name. Tell me my lawyer is an idiot and our filing system just had a clerical error." Leo sank into a mesh chair, looking smaller than usual. "Brian, I spent the last 3 hours in the digital vault. I went back to the original commits, the base code for the predictive engine, the stuff we call the Oracle. It wasn't pushed from your terminal in 2014. "Then whose?" "Hers," Leo whispered. "Leo, it was pushed from a private server registered to an S. Sterling. The timestamps are dated 6 months before you even moved out of that basement. She didn't just proofread your work, Brian. She wrote it. You did the UI, the marketing, the pitch decks. But the engine? The thing that actually calculates the data? It's hers. It's always been hers." Brian felt a surge of hot, blinding rage. He grabbed a heavy glass award from his desk, a Tech Founder of the Year trophy, and hurled it at the wall. It shattered into 1,000 jagged diamonds. "I am the visionary," Brian screamed. "I'm the one who stood on the stages. I'm the one who took the risks. She was the wife. She sat in the background and smiled." "She sat in the background and built a cage, Brian," Leo said quietly. "And we just spent 10 years decorating it." Brian ignored him, his mind scrambling for a way out. He was a shark. Sharks didn't stop, they bit. "It doesn't matter. I have the keys. I have the admin rights. We're launching the 3.0 update tonight. Once that's live, we'll obfuscate the core engine, rewrite the modules, and by the time her lawyers get a court date, the S. Sterling code will be obsolete. Push the update, Leo. Now." "We can't," Leo said, his voice hollow. "Why the hell not?" "Because at 9:05 this morning, 10 minutes before she signed those papers, the admin privileges for the entire Thorn Logic root directory were transferred to an external user." "Who?" Brian's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Nemesis admin." The encryption keys were changed, the salt hashes were rotated, and the two-factor authentication is tied to a device probably in Monaco right now. Brian lunged for his laptop, his fingers flying across the keys. Access denied. He tried his emergency override. Unauthorized user. He tried the physical server bypass. Hardware locked. "She's locked us out of our own company," Brian gasped. "It gets worse," Leo added, sounding like he wanted to cry. "Our entire infrastructure, the backups, the client data, the live environment, is hosted on Amazon AWS. I just got an automated alert. The billing account for our AWS servers was tied to a personal American Express card, Sophia's card, the one she's used for household expenses for a decade. So, change the card, put it on the company account. We tried, but the account owner, Sophia, cancelled the card at noon. And because she's the sole account holder for the AWS instance, Amazon's policy kicked in for a high-value non-payment delinquency. They didn't just pause us, Brian. Because she flagged the account as fraudulent, unauthorized, they wiped the temporary cache. We're offline. The website is a 404 error. The app is dead. Thorn Logic. It's just a logo and some rented furniture." Brian slumped into his chair, the world spinning in nauseating circles. He looked out the glass wall at his 20-year-old employees, the ones who thought he was the next Steve Jobs. They were starting to pack their bags. His phone buzzed. It was Silas Vance again. "What now, Silas?" Brian asked, his voice dead. "Did she take my clothes too?" "Brian, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Silas said, his voice sounding like it was coming from a very long distance. I'm looking at the venture capital agreement you signed last year with Horizon Ventures, the $50 million injection to scale the business. Yeah, what about it? It was a standard loan. No, it wasn't. Because you were so eager to get the cash before the Q3 audit, you signed a personal guarantee. You put up your marital assets as collateral. But Brian, you just signed a divorce decree and an asset waiver stating that the Tribeca penthouse, the Hamptons house, and the IP are not marital assets. They are Sophia's separate property. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Which means, Silas continued, you've committed technical fraud against the bank. You pledged assets you didn't own. Horizon Ventures just triggered a default clause. They're calling in the $50 million, Brian. Immediately, they're freezing your personal bank accounts, your stock portfolio, and they've filed an emergency lien on your liquid assets to cover the debt. Brian looked down at his trembling hands. How much is in the operating account, Leo? Brian whispered. Leo checked his tablet, his face grim. After the rebranding party last month and the deposit you put on that Aspen chalet, we have about $300,000. I need $50 million, Brian said, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in his throat. He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the streets of New York. He could see the paparazzi gathering at the entrance. He could see the world he had built, the world of private jets, red carpets, and studied casualness, turning into a cloud of ash. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed Sophia's number again. He didn't expect it to work. He expected the disconnected tone, but this time it rang. 1, 2, 3. Hello, Brian. Her voice was crisp, clear, and perfectly calm. In the background, he could hear the sound of the ocean and the faint rhythmic clinking of a silver spoon against a porcelain cup. Sophia, Brian choked out, his arrogance finally stripped away, leaving nothing but a raw, bleeding ego. Sarah, please. You've made your point. You win. Just give me the encryption keys. Give me the house back. We can renegotiate. I'll give you whatever you want. Renegotiate? Sophia laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh. It was the sound of a person who found a joke genuinely amusing, which hurt 10 times worse. Brian, you spent 10 years telling me I didn't understand business. You told me I was just a support system. You told me the real work was done by the visionaries. I was wrong. I was an idiot. I'm sorry. Yes, you were, she said, her voice turning as cold as the Mediterranean at midnight. But that's not why I'm doing this. Then why? Why destroy everything we built? We didn't build it, Brian. I built it. You just sold it, she said. And then you brought that woman into my bed. You brought her into the house I decorated. Drove her in the car I paid for. You thought I was blind because I was quiet. You forgot that the quietest people are the ones who are listening. I'll leave her. I'll fire Catelyn right now. Oh, Brian, Sophia sighed. I don't care about Catelyn. She's just a symptom of your disease. The disease is your ego, and I'm the cure. Sarah, the bank is calling the loan. I'll be bankrupt. I'll go to jail. I know, she said soothingly. I sent the tip to the SEC this morning. I'd start looking for a good public defender if I were you, Brian. The ones Silas Vance provides are very expensive, and I don't think your credit cards are going to work much longer. Sarah, I have to go, Brian. The sun is setting, and I have a dinner reservation with Sebastian. He wants to talk about acquiring the Thorn Logic ruins for pennies on the dollar. It's going to be a lovely evening. The line went dead. Brian stared at the phone as the lights in his office flickered and then died, the building's power cut for non-payment. In the darkness, the only thing he could see was the glowing red recording light of a security camera he hadn't noticed before, tucked high in the corner of his ceiling. The board meeting of Thorn Logic was not a discussion. It was a firing squad. Brian stood at the head of the conference table, his dress shirt stained with sweat, his tie loosened like a hangman's noose. He looked at the faces of the people who had once called him a prophet. Now they looked at him with the cold, clinical detachedness of surgeons observing a terminal tumor. "Explain this to me like I'm a 5-year-old, Brian," said Eleanor Vance, the lead investor from Horizon Ventures and Silas Vance's cousin. She was a woman who could cut glass with her jawline and a reputation for being even more ruthless than her relative. "You divorced your wife, you gave her nothing, and now she owns our intellectual property. How is that possible?" "It's a misunderstanding," Brian shouted, his voice cracking. He slammed his hand on the mahogany table, but nobody flinched. "It's a clerical error in the patent filing from the early days. Sophia handled the paperwork. She's manipulated the records. We're filing an injunction. We'll sue her for every cent she's worth." "With what money?" Eleanor asked, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft register. "Your personal accounts have been frozen. The company's liquidity is trapped in an AWS billing dispute we can't resolve because we don't own the account. And I just got off the phone with the lawyer for Nemesis Holdings." Brian's heart hammered. "What did they say?" "They're offering to license the Oracle engine back to us," Eleanor said, throwing a courier packet onto the table. "At a rate of $10 million a month. Plus, they want a seat on the board, specifically the chairperson's seat." "That's my seat," Brian shrieked. "Not anymore," Eleanor said. She looked around the table. "I move for a vote of no confidence in CEO Brian Thorne. All in favor." Every hand in the room went up. Even Leo, the CTO who had lived in that Queen's basement with them, didn't look Brian in the eye as he raised his hand. "You're fired, Brian," Eleanor said, her voice sounding like a gavel. "Security will escort you out. Don't bother going back to your office. It's been locked. Your belongings will be sent to, well, wherever it is you're staying." 2 large security guards, men Brian had hired himself, stepped forward. One of them took Brian by the elbow. "Don't touch me," Brian spat, shaking him off. "I'm the founder. I am the visionary." "You're a liability," Eleanor retorted. "And frankly, it looks like your ex-wife was the brains of the operation all along. We'd rather be in business with her." Brian was marched out of the building like a common criminal. As he stepped onto the cobblestone streets of Dumbo, the paparazzi swarmed. The flashes were blinding. "Brian, are you bankrupt? Is it true Sophia stole the code? Where is Catalin?" He pushed through the crowd, his head down, and reached his Tesla. He tapped his phone to unlock the door. The app spun. Access denied. He tapped it again. "Owner has restricted access." "What?" Brian yelled at the phone. "I am the owner." Then he remembered. The Tesla was registered to the company. Eleanor had probably deactivated his digital key 30 seconds after the vote. He was standing on the street, sweating and humiliated, without a car, a company, or a home. He hailed a taxi, his last remaining credit card, the one he kept for emergency travel, barely working enough to cover the fare to the Soho apartment he had rented for Catalin. He needed comfort. He needed someone to tell him it wasn't his fault. He needed Catalin to tell him that they would find a way to Aspen, that they would start over. When he arrived at the Soho loft, the door was unlocked. "Cat?" Brian called out, stepping into the minimalist living room. "Babe, I'm home. It's bad, Cat. It's really bad." The silence that met him was chilling. He walked into the bedroom. The closet doors were wide open. The designer clothes he had bought her, the Versace, the Gucci, the Balenciaga, were gone. The jewelry box on the nightstand was empty. He ran to the safe in the closet. The combination was his birthday. He punched it in. The safe swung open. The $50,000 in emergency cash he had stashed there was gone. His 3 Rolexes were gone. Even the hard drive containing his private cryptocurrency keys had vanished. On the bed, there was a single item left behind, a kale salad in a plastic container, half-eaten and wilting. Brian sank onto the bed, the reality hitting him like a physical blow. Catalin wasn't a soulmate. She was a rat sensing the rising water. She had cleaned him out the moment the news of the board vote hit the wire. His phone buzzed. It wasn't a call, it was a notification from a private messaging app he hadn't used in months. It was a video file from an unknown sender. He opened it. The video was graining, recorded from a hidden camera. It was Catelyn, sitting in this very bedroom, talking to someone off camera. This wasn't the sweet, giggling Catelyn he knew. This woman was sharp, focused and bored. "Yeah, he's an easy mark," Catelyn said in the video, filing her nails. "He tells me everything, the patents, the bank accounts, the passwords. He thinks I'm in love with him because I laugh at his stupid jokes. How long do I have to keep this up?" "Just until the divorce is final," a voice replied from off camera. Brian's blood turned to ice. He knew that voice. It was Gregory, Sophia's driver. "And the bonus?" Catelyn asked. "Ms. Sterling is very generous," Gregory replied. "She's already set up your account in Zurich. Consider it a performance fee for services rendered." The video ended. Brian let the phone fall from his hand. He realized now that Catelyn hadn't just been a mistress. She had been Sophia's spy. Sophia hadn't just discovered the affair. She had orchestrated the environment for it to happen, ensuring that Brian's vanity would lead him right into the arms of someone who would report back his every move. She had used his own lust and ego as the primary weapon for his destruction. He crawled across the floor to the window, watching the rain wash over New York. Far away, in the quiet luxury of the Mediterranean, he knew Sophia was watching him. He could almost feel her eyes on him through the camera in the Soho loft. He was alone. He was broke, and the FBI hadn't even started knocking yet. But then a memory flickered in the back of his mind. A memory of a cold dorm room at MIT in 2014. A memory of a boy named Toby Miller. Toby, the real genius. Toby, who was dead. "She knows," Brian whispered into the empty room. "She knows about Toby." The thought was more terrifying than the bankruptcy, more terrifying than the divorce, because if Sophia knew about Toby, she didn't just want his money. She wanted him in a cage. 3 days after being unceremoniously dumped onto the streets of Dumbo, Brian Thorne sat in the green room of the Brad Calver show. It was the most watched cable news program in the country, hosted by a man who built his brand on outrage, scandal, and defending the forgotten man. Brian looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the person staring back. He looked hollow. His skin was sallow, and there were dark, bruised circles under his eyes. He had told the makeup artist to leave the imperfections. "Let them see the pain," he had thought. "Let them see what she did to me." He smoothed his tie, a polyester blend he'd bought off the rack at a department store because his bespoke silk ties were locked behind the doors of a penthouse he no longer owned. The fabric made his neck itch, a constant, irritating reminder of his fall. "5 minutes, Mr. Thorne," a production assistant said, barely looking up from her clipboard. Brian took a deep breath. This was it, the Hail Mary. If he could win the court of public opinion, he could pressure the board of Thorne Logic. He could paint Sophia as a conniving, vengeful ex-wife who had colluded with a foreign billionaire to dismantle an American success story. He would use the victim card, the very thing he used to mock. He walked onto the stage. The studio lights were blinding, a white-hot wall of heat that made the sweat prickle on his forehead. The applause from the audience was polite but hesitant. "Welcome back," Brad Calver said, leaning over his desk like a bulldog. "We're sitting down with Brian Thorne, the man who invented Thorne Logic, the man who revolutionized data prediction, and the man who, 48 hours ago, was literally locked out of his own empire while his ex-wife drank champagne on a mega yacht in Monaco. Brian, tell us, how did a titan of tech end up on the sidewalk?" Brian leaned into the microphone, putting on his best, hurt puppy face. "Brad, it's a tragedy. I trusted her. For 10 years I thought I was building a future for my family. I worked 18-hour days. I bled for that company, and while I was focused on the work, Sophia was focused on the leverage. She executed a premeditated hostile takeover using documents I didn't even know existed. It's not just a divorce, Brad. It's corporate espionage. Espionage? Calver asked, his eyes lighting up. Those are big words, Brian. Are you saying she stole your work? She stole the soul of the company, Brian lied, his voice growing stronger with every manufactured word. She tricked me into signing things during a vulnerable time. She's a con artist, Brad, and she's backed by Sebastian Vane, a man who makes a living destroying American businesses. They're trying to silence me. Well, you're not silent now, Calver said, turning to the camera. America, look at this man. This is what happens when the legal system is weaponized against... Suddenly, the studio lights flickered. The massive screen behind Brian, which had been displaying a flattering, high-resolution photo of him in his prime, turned to static grey. "What's going on?" Calver snapped, looking toward the control booth. "We lost the feed?" "It's not us," a voice shouted back. "The signal is being overridden." On the screen, a waveform appeared, an audio file. Before Brian could even register the danger, a voice boomed through the studio speakers. It was unmistakable. It was Brian's voice, but it wasn't the humble, broken version the audience was seeing. It was the arrogant, slurring voice of a drunk Brian, recorded months ago in the privacy of his bedroom with Catelyn. Recording. "The investors are such sheep, Cat. I swear. I walk in there, throw around some buzzwords like neural networks and synergy, and they just write the checks. They think I'm a genius." Catelyn's voice. "But aren't you worried they'll find out about the code, that you didn't actually write the base engine?" Brian's voice, laughing. "Find out what? That I didn't write it? Who's going to tell them? Toby Miller. Toby's been in a box underground since 2014. Dead men don't file lawsuits, babe." The studio went deathly silent. Brian felt his heart stop. His lungs refused to take in air. Catelyn's voice. "Brian, that's dark. You said you guys were best friends at MIT. Brian's voice. "We were. And Toby was a poet with code. But he was weak. He OD'd in that dorm room and left his laptop open. I didn't kill him, Cat. I just rescued his work. I took the hard drive before the campus police even arrived. I took Atlas, renamed it Thorn Logic, and made $1 billion. It's natural selection. The strong inherit the earth, or in this case, the hard drive." The audio cut out. The silence that followed was heavier than gravity. Brad Calver stared at Brian, his mouth slightly open. The audience was frozen. Brian stood there, his face draining of color until he looked like a wax figure melting under the stage lights. "Toby," Brian whispered to himself, the name a ghost he hadn't dared to speak in a decade. Toby Miller, the quiet kid, the real architect, the one Brian had left to rot while he stole his legacy. "You stole it?" Calver asked, his voice low. He wasn't playing a character anymore. He was genuinely disgusted. "You stole your entire company from a dead kid." "It's a deep fake," Brian screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched shriek. "It's AI. Sophia is doing this. She's framing me." But the screen behind him changed again. It wasn't audio this time. It was a document. A police report from the Cambridge Police Department, dated May 2014. A list of items found in Toby Miller's dorm room. At the bottom, a handwritten note from an officer. "Roommate Brian Thorne claims laptop was missing prior to discovery of body." Next to it, another document appeared. A receipt from a high-end pawn shop in Boston, dated 2 days after Toby's death. Seller, Brian Thorne. Item, 1 TB encrypted external hard drive. The audience began to murmur. A woman in the front row stood up and walked out. Then another. "She has the receipts," someone whispered loudly. "Cut the feed," Brian yelled, lunging toward the nearest camera. "Stop filming! I'll sue you all!" He tackled a cameraman, knocking the expensive equipment to the floor. The live feed went sideways, showing a blurry, chaotic angle of Brian Thorne, the visionary, wrestling with security guards on the floor, screaming obscenities like a cornered animal. "Get off me!" Brian howled as two burly guards dragged him off the stage. "I am the CEO! I am the future!" In the control booth, the producer turned to Brad Calver. "Did we just broadcast that to 7 million people?" Calver nodded slowly, wiping a bead of sweat from his lip. "Yeah, and I think we just gave Sophia Sterling the biggest win in the history of New York City." Brian was thrown out the back exit of the studio, directly into a rain-slicked alleyway. His suit was torn, and his left shoe was missing. He scrambled up, his phone vibrating incessantly in his pocket. He pulled it out. 142 missed calls. A text from his mother. "Brian, is it true? Did you do that to Toby?" A text from Silas Vance. "The FBI is issuing a warrant for securities fraud and theft. I am resigning as your counsel effective immediately. Do not call me." Brian leaned against the brick wall and slid down into the trash, the cold rain soaking through his shirt. He was no longer a billionaire. He was no longer a victim. He was a thief who had been caught by a woman who had waited 10 years to pull the trigger. Brian Thorne was no longer a man. He was a frantic pulse of adrenaline and terror wrapped in a wet, torn suit. He scrambled out of the alley, his single shoe slapping against the pavement in a rhythmic, mocking beat. He could hear the sirens in the distance. Real or imagined, it didn't matter. The world was closing in. The FBI warrant was a death sentence, but the public exposure of Toby Miller's ghost was a haunting from which no lawyer could protect him. He reached the corner of 48th and saw a bicycle leaning against a street lamp. It was a rusted delivery bike, its chain dripping with black grease. Without a second thought, Brian snapped the flimsy plastic lock with a desperate heave and pedaled. He didn't have a destination, he just had a direction, away. He pedaled until his lungs burned like they were filled with acid. By the time he reached the outskirts of the city, the rain had turned into a torrential downpour, washing the expensive gel from his hair and turning his white shirt into a translucent second skin. He looked like a drowned rat. He felt like one too. He ditched the bike in a donation bin near a gas station and found a discarded, oversized grey hoodie at the bottom of the pile. He pulled it on, the smell of mildew and stale tobacco a far cry from the sandalwood and amber of his former life. He caught his reflection in the gas station window. The billionaire visionary was gone. In his place stood a vagrant with hollow eyes. The Hamptons, he thought. The Apocalypse Fund. 3 years ago, during a brief bout of cocaine-fueled paranoia about a global market crash, Brian had withdrawn $2 million in cash. He had hidden it in the wine cellar of the Hamptons estate, behind a false panel in the climate control unit. He had never told Sophia. He had never told Kathleen. It was his ultimate safety net, the one thing the SEC couldn't freeze and the banks couldn't claw back. He couldn't take a train. The stations would be crawling with facial recognition software. He couldn't call a car. He stood by the entrance to the Long Island Expressway, his thumb out, shivering in the dark. For 2 hours, cars splashed past him, their headlights blinding him before leaving him in deeper darkness. Finally, a rusted semi-truck pulled over. The driver was a thick-necked man who didn't speak English and didn't seem to care that his passenger looked like a fugitive. Brian sat in the cab, the hum of the engine vibrating through his bones, listening to the static on the radio. He was invisible. For the first time in a decade, Brian Thorne didn't exist to the world, and it was the most terrifying freedom he had ever known. It was nearly 2 a.m. when the truck dropped him off 3 miles from the estate. Brian walked the rest of the way, his feet blistering inside his remaining sock. The Hamptons, usually a playground of manicured hedges and golden light, felt like a graveyard. The massive estates loomed like mausoleums. He reached the perimeter of his property, the Aurora Estate. It was a $20 million masterpiece of glass and cedar perched on a cliff overlooking the crashing waves of the Atlantic. The gate was locked, but Brian knew the blind spots in the security cameras. He had spent $50,000 on this system to keep the world out. Now he was using that knowledge to sneak back into his own life. He hopped the fence, landing hard on his knees in the wet mulch. He crept through the gardens, past the infinity pool that looked like a black void in the rain. He reached the cellar doors at the side of the house. They were heavy, reinforced steel. He pressed his trembling fingers to the keypad. 1984. He had chosen the code because he thought he was Orwellian, a grand architect of the new truth. The lock clicked with a heavy mechanical thud. He slipped inside. The air in the cellar was chilled to a perfect 55 degrees. It smelled of oak, expensive cork, and the dusty silence of a tomb. Brian pulled out his phone, using the flickering flashlight to navigate past rows of Bordeaux and Screaming Eagle that he would never drink. He reached the back wall where the climate control unit hummed with a low, steady vibration. His heart was beating so fast he thought it might burst through his ribs. This was it. $2 million. A private boat to the Caribbean. A new name. A new life. He pried at the false wooden panel with his fingernails, but they were too short, jagged from his frantic escape. He grabbed a heavy bottle of 1945 Mouton Rothschild from a nearby rack and smashed the base against the panel. The wood splintered. He dropped the bottle, shattering $5,000 of wine without a thought, and ripped the panel away with his bare hands. He reached into the dark, hollow cavity. His hand met nothing but cold, empty air. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "No, no, no." He reached deeper, his arm disappearing into the wall up to the elbow. He felt around frantically, his fingers scraping against the insulation. The duffel bag, the stacks of hundreds, the weight of his survival. It was gone. Looking for this? The voice didn't come from behind him. It came from everywhere. It boomed through the high-end Sonos speakers hidden in the cellar ceiling. Brian spun around, dropping his phone. The flashlight beam skittered across the floor, illuminating the top of the cellar stairs. Suddenly, the lights in the cellar blazed on, blinding him. Brian covered his eyes, hissing. As his vision adjusted, he saw a laptop sitting on a wooden crate at the foot of the stairs. The screen was open, its glow a ghostly blue in the bright room. On the screen was a live video feed. Sophia was there. She was sitting in the plush cabin of the Leviathan, wearing a white silk robe, a glass of vintage Dom Perignon in her hand. Behind her, through the yacht's window, the sun was beginning to rise over the Mediterranean. And in her other cache, she was holding a thick, banded stack of $100 bills. She was fanning herself with it, a look of mild, bored amusement on her face. "Sarah," Brian gasped, falling to his knees on the cold concrete. "Sophia, you took it. How? I never told you." "I handled the accounts for 10 years, Brian," Sophia said through the speakers, her voice echoing off the wine racks. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice a $2 million cash withdrawal? I saw the transaction. I followed you on the security feed. I watched you hide it 3 years ago." "You let me think it was there," Brian sobbed. "You let me believe." "I needed you to have a destination," she said, her eyes turning as hard as the diamonds she used to wear. "I knew that when the world collapsed around you, when your ego finally burned your empire to the ground, you'd run to your little safety net like a rat to a piece of poisoned cheese. I wanted you to come here, Brian. I wanted you to see exactly how empty your life has become." "Why?" Brian screamed, his voice raw. "Why torture me like this? Just call the police. Just let it end." "I didn't call the police, Brian," she said softly, leaning closer to the camera. "I called someone else." Brian stopped breathing. A cold, primal dread washed over him. "Who?" "Toby Miller's mother," Sophia replied. The name hit Brian like a physical blow. "She's a lovely woman, Brian. She lives in a small house in Ohio. She's been mourning her son for a decade, thinking he was just a junkie who threw his brilliance away. She didn't know he was the architect of a billion-dollar company. She didn't know his best friend was the one who left him to die and stole the keys to his kingdom. Sarah, please. I sent her the recordings, Brian, all of them, and I sent her the location of this house. I told her you might be stopping by to pick up your inheritance. She's not here, of course. She's too old to travel that fast. But her lawyers are, and they've filed a civil suit that will strip you of every penny you ever thought you possessed. Outside, in the distance, the wail of sirens began to grow. This time, they weren't in his head. They were coming down the long, winding driveway of the Aurora estate. "The police are here to report a trespasser," Sophia said, raising her glass to the camera. "A property which, as you know, belongs to Nemesis Holdings. You're breaking and entering, Brian, on top of the securities fraud, on top of the theft." Brian looked at the screen, at the woman he had underestimated for a decade. He realized now that her silence during the divorce wasn't a surrender. It was the deep, focused breath a sniper takes before pulling the trigger. "Who are you?" Brian whispered. "You're not the woman I married." "No," Sophia said, the smallest, coldest smile touching her lips. "The woman you married was a role I played for an audience of one. But you forgot the most important rule of the theatre, Brian. When the sun goes down, the shadows get longer, and it is very, very dark for you now." The cellar doors above burst open. "Police, show me your hands!" Flashlights cut through the gloom, the beams dancing over the racks of wine. Brian didn't move. He just stared at the laptop. "Goodbye, Brian," Sophia said. The screen went black. Sophia Sterling stood on the deck of the Leviathan, watching the sun dip below the horizon of the Aegean Sea. The water was the color of bruised plums and liquid gold. Sebastian Vane walked up behind her, handing her a glass of sparkling water. "He got the book today," Sebastian noted, checking his tablet. "Our contact in the mailroom says he laughed for an hour." "Good," Sophia said, looking out at the infinite blue. "It's better to laugh than to scream. It's quieter." "You really gave it all away, didn't you?" Sebastian asked, looking at her with genuine curiosity. "The IP, the shares. You could have been the wealthiest woman in the tech sector." "I don't want to be a titan, Sebastian," Sophia replied. "I spent 10 years living with a man who wanted to own the sun. I'd rather just enjoy the warmth." She took a sip of her water, feeling the cool breeze on her face. For the first time in her life, she didn't have to be perfect. She didn't have to be a support system. She didn't have to be a shadow. The silent settlement was finally complete. She had walked away with her dignity, her freedom, and the truth. Brian Thorne had thought his wife was weak because she didn't fight back with noise. He didn't realize that in a world of screaming matches and Twitter wars, silence isn't a lack of words. It's the deep breath a sniper takes before the final shot. Be careful who you underestimate. The quiet ones aren't quiet because they have nothing to say. They're quiet because they're plotting. And when they finally speak, they make sure it's the only thing the world remembers. This was the story of the silent settlement. A brutal reminder that the person you ignore the most might be the one writing your ending. Brian Thorne played checkers with his ego, while Sophia Sterling played 4D chess with his soul. If you enjoyed this tale of ultimate karma and high society revenge, make sure to smash that like button and share this video with someone who loves a good villain gets what they deserve story. What would you have done? Would you have taken the 200 million and run, or would you have stayed to burn the legacy to the ground like Sophia did? Tell us in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next deep dive into the most incredible stories of betrayal and justice. Thanks for watching, and remember, stay quiet, stay focused, and always check the fine print.